All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's leadership webinar with Nonprofit Quarterly. Today, we're talking about going beyond donor centrism, building authentic alignment with your supporters. And we have a wonderful panel of leaders and fundraising experts to lead us in that conversation. My name is Jean Bell, and I organize these leadership webinars for Nonprofit Quarterly, and we welcome you. Next slide, please, Bethany. Before we dive in, I just want to remind those of you who aren't members about our Leading Edge membership program. With that Leading Edge membership, you get access to these live monthly webinars, plus the entire library of these leadership webinars, and a digital subscription to Nonprofit Quarterly magazine, which you see some of our recent issues there, has really been transformed of late under the leadership of our new editor-in-chief, Cindy Suarez. So you can find that membership sign up in the upper right-hand corner of our homepage if you are not yet a member. And welcome to all of you who are. Today's session is a 90-minute session. As always, we're recording it. You'll get the slides and the recording in several days. We use the Q&A box so you can comment on each other's questions, upvote them, etc. And I'll be moderating that Q&A box. Bethany has built in some Q&A sections throughout this session, so there'll be time to hear from you. And we always evaluate our sessions. So please stay on as we close the session. A very brief survey will pop up. And if you can just take 2 minutes to give us your feedback, we would appreciate that so much. So without further ado, next slide, please. I am so thrilled to welcome Bethany Mackey to Nonprofit Quarterly. We've met before as part of other work about raising money across progressive organizations. She is the executive director of Progressive Multiplier, and I'm going to read a sentence from their mission statement. This is a very cool intermediary if you are first learning of it today. Through their online community of practice and grant making and support programs, Progressive Multiplier builds the progressive sector's keyword revenue generation, knowledge, and skills. And that's what really excites me about the work they do, is helping progressive organizations really intentionally build out their earned and contributed revenue strategies so that they can go to scale on the issues they need to go to scale on. And so you bring that, your own history, I think 20 plus years, right, of digital marketing, fundraising, et cetera, plus now this intermediary experience of working with grantees and funders to really center this issue of revenue generation for progressive causes. So glad you're here. And I'm going to turn it over to you and let you move forward with introducing the panel.
Thanks so much, Jean. I appreciate you holding this space for us and for the very kind introduction. And I'm now feeling all of the gray hairs on my temples for my 20 plus years of fundraising experience. So last June, as he was getting ready to step down from People's Action's executive directorship, George Gale wrote a letter to new executive directors on his blog, The Fundamentals of Organizing. In it, he said, somehow on your way to becoming a great organizer, you became an executive director. Suddenly, you're reviewing bylaws, trying to make sense of the balance sheet, and wondering how your ability to organize people prepared you for this. Let me be the first to say it didn't. So as the new executive director of Progressive Multiplier, let me say that George's letter gave me great comfort. Only I wasn't on my way to becoming a great organizer when I became an executive director. I was a fundraiser, a small dollar raised in the tradition of walks and galas and golf tournaments and online appeal campaigns fundraiser for nonprofits, mostly in healthcare. Through that journey, I met one of our panelists, Angie Moore. Angie was the one who educated me within the context of those healthcare nonprofits on the necessity of building a holistic view of a supporter and really reframed my understanding of my responsibility as a fundraiser, to use what I knew about a supporter to give them a relevant experience with the organization. So in other words, Angie taught me how to be authentically supporter-centric. And as Jean mentioned, my career path has turned from one that's less about doing individual fundraising and more about resourcing the people that do that kind of fundraising, but mostly for power building and organizing groups. I met Brandon and Jennifer of Detroit Action. They too educated me in a way that profoundly changed how I think of my responsibility as a fundraiser. Brandon and Jennifer's perspective on resourcing community organizing crystallized questions I had about donor centrism. And how should it manifest in different types of nonprofits? Those that are providing direct service, those who are educating and advocating for change, and those who are building power through relationships with and for their own communities. So today I am beyond thrilled to have the opportunity to assemble this panel of people who have made me think differently to dig into those questions together. So could I ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and give a little background about their journey as a fundraiser and their current role? And I will kick it to Jennifer first.
Hey everyone, my name is Jennifer Disla. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm the co-executive director of Detroit Action. And yeah, a little bit about my journey. I started as an organizer quite some time ago in 2008, and recently transitioned to a co-executive directorship in 2021. And super excited to just really utilize the power of story and the power of connection to really connect with funders around what's happening on the ground and how to build from there. So I'll pass it back. Glad to be here.
Jennifer. Brandon, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, so hey folks, Brandon Snyder, he, him, his, also co-executive director at Detroit Action. I've been in this role now since the end of 2016. Detroit Action is a grassroots member-led community-based organization building power for working class Black and brown folks here in Metro Detroit. Our organization really aims to make sure that we are able to not only change policy or not only change politics here in Michigan, but also the conditions around it. So we make sure that we are able to provide the agency and the leadership development for our members, many of whom are homeless or housing insecure, many of whom are families who've been impacted by violence in the criminal justice system, many of whom are parents or young people. We work to provide them with the agency and the community to change policy and to change politics, both for themselves and for the broader community around them. And so, I got my start in this work, a decade and a half ago as a volunteer, then as a campaign manager, and now, as an organizer as well, and now as the executive director. And, this work matters to me, because it's profound and important as a person who comes from a family of working class Black folks here in the city of Detroit. So I'll start right there. I know that there's probably more time to introduce myself, but I'll start right there.
Thanks, Brandon. Angie?
Yeah. Hello, everybody. First of all, I'm sorry to say you're probably also going to meet my cat Marbles as you see her tail. I've just learned during this remote time frame that the more I push her away, the more insistent she is on being on the screen. So you will see Marbles throughout the session today. So I work for an organization named CARE. First of all, I've been around a really long time. Bethany is young compared to me. I'm looking at my profile picture here and I'm thinking, gosh, that's like 4 years ago. And look how brown my hair was. I am definitely a little grayer now, but I work for CARE. We're an international relief organization. We work in about 102, 103 countries around the world, working on social justice and poverty. But the one thing I will say is that if you're thinking you don't know who CARE is, you really do know who we are. We're the founders of the CARE package. So we're the ones that we launched our organization in 1945 and sent care packages, had people in America packing care packages that were then shipped over to the millions of Americans that were just impacted by the aftermath of the war. So that's who I am. And I've worked on both the nonprofit side and the agency side. And I'm happy to be here with you all.
Thanks, Angie. And if you want to contact or follow any of our panelists, you've got Jennifer and Angie's email addresses up there if you want to reach out to them, or Brandon on Twitter. And our chief storyteller, Violeta Bermudez, is actually live tweeting at our handle at Prog Multiplier. So feel free to join in the conversation and reach out to any of us as questions come up after the panel. But with that, let's go ahead and jump in. So when we talk about donor centrism today, we're not talking about the being a good and responsible human behaviors like thanking a donor and not treating them like an ATM. And we're also not talking about the opposite end of the spectrum where we're being bad mission stewards to please a donor, like letting donors drive how we solve problems versus honoring the agency of those who want and need solutions, or partnering with bad actors, or perpetuating any othering of the communities we serve. Today, we really want to focus on that fuzzy middle of donor centrism, about how we as fundraisers create donor culture and expectations, and how that affects how other nonprofit groups raise money and can raise money. Vu Le, who is a former executive director of a social justice nonprofit in Seattle and author of the Nonprofit AF blog, said, "I believe in many of the tenets of donor centrism. Don't treat donors like ATMs, appreciate every gift of any amount, don't take donors for granted, build relationships, be transparent, etc. I just don't believe that donors should be the center of nonprofit work or the center of fundraising work. An argument can be made that the donor-centered model has been so prevalent in our sector because it works. There are lots of data showing that different donor-centered strategies work. But just because something works doesn't necessarily mean that it is intrinsically good. Everything is interrelated in our sector, but we have behaved as if each mission is its own self-sufficient silo, a philosophy that has been reinforced by donor centrism. And because of that, a host of unintended problems are created. So our hypothesis for this conversation today is that it's on us to bring the good to the donor-centered model so that we don't create these unintended problems. And that's the conversation we want to have today. So donor centrism at its good core is simply as a way to validate a donor's motivations for giving. This donor-centric pledge from Ahern and Joyo's book, Keep Your Donors, contains a lot of those good basics and fundamental truths that we as fundraisers have to embrace. But notice what you don't see on here. We don't see things that used to be so common, like portraying donors as the only hero and minimizing all of the elements that a solution takes, or taking donations that aren't values aligned or from those who want to drive a program. That gets us into that bad mission steward part of donor centrism we never want to get into. But there are some statements on here that are a little cringy, as my team likes to say when we're not quite sure how to classify it. It's a little cringy. Like fundraisers are in the feel-good business. But we can't deny that there are basic human needs and motivations behind someone's motivations to give. And they give more and give more frequently when we validate those emotions with donor-centric behavior. So, a little poll for you guys. Are we in the feel-good business as fundraisers? Yes or no, or yes and something else?
Oh, I just realized I don't get to vote.
I know, I thought the same thing. I'm like, oh man.
I was like, wait, why can't I click my button?
Yeah, I'm just giving people a couple more seconds.
Because I know there are some opinions on this panel.
Oh yes, they're flying in. Oh yeah. Okay, I'm gonna close that poll and share the results.
All right. 12% yes, 19% no, and 69% yes and. So we definitely have a huge yes and, which I am definitely a yes and. What do you think, panel? Are we yes and people here for the most part? No's, yeses, what do you think?
I'm a yes and.
Jennifer, what about you?
I would say yes and as well.
Brandon?
I'm torn. I would say yes and as well.
You're between a yes and a no? Is that where the tear is?
Yes.
Well, I think that good for me, I'm a yes and because good is just too simple. And I think it releases us from our responsibility as fundraisers to understand all the motivations, which is really, I think, at the core of some of the unintended consequences around donor centrism. So let's talk about those motivations for a second. So outside of the good, what motivates donors to give to your organization?
I'll launch this poll, Bethany.
Please.
This one is a choose all that truly apply, right? So if you really experience any of these as motivations of your organization's donors, you can click as many as apply. All right.
Let's see what we got.
There you go.
All right. So it looks like our big winners are to have an impact through an organization they know and trust, and that peer component of wanting to join others to accomplish a mission, and living their values. I think those are the ones that stand out. But there are no super low go. I'm excited to see that the lowest vote getter is to have influence over our leadership and strategic direction, but still 45 out of 132 is not a small percentage. So that's a bit of what we're going to get into today. Jean, can I ask you to close that one out? We're going to put the panel on the hot seat. So guys, I want to talk about why donors give to your specific organizations and how do you validate that behavior, since that starts that donor-centric cycle. And also would love to put a particular lens on, has that validation changed, or how you raise money and talk to your donors changed throughout the pandemic and the sort of, simultaneous uprisings for racial justice. And have we really conditioned donors to feel validated in a certain way, both before that time and during that time? So, Brandon, can I kick to you to start?
Yeah, sure. So, the question is, why do donors give to our organization, or where do you want me to start from?
Start at the top, wherever you want to dive in.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We're an organization. Our belief is being, a union for the hood, literally, in a sense, where we want to be able to not only impact policy and politics, but we also want to be able to defend those with jobs and without jobs. So being able to make sure that people have a political home to be able to learn to be activists and leaders in their community, to be able to grow, to be able to be around people who care about the issues, and also to develop an analysis. And so with that sort of boilerplate or strategy, we try to engage donors, who care about community organizing, donors who believe that the pathway to power in our communities and the pathway to change policy isn't through parachuting in, isn't through, just traditional comms and sort of top level strategies, but it's actually through engaging people and giving them, and regular people, and giving them the tools to shape their communities. And, I think when I think about donor centrism, and I think about the role that I have as a fundraiser in this work, it's about seeing donors, and this is, as collaborators and partners in this strategy. And that also means seeing them as folks who, are collaborators and thought partners in building a long-term relationship. And, we all know that, like, sometimes that won't be the case, that there are some folks who are transactional, but then those folks, raise the red flags for me around, like, what is it that you're in this for? If our work inherently is relational, and our work is inherently the leadership development construction of activism, I have red flags. Now, as an ED, I have to maneuver through that and work through it. But, I think, the validation that I try to provide, or I think about when it comes to, like, building relationships, and when it comes to, engaging folks, is about, how do we build deep relationships? How do we see the donors that we want to build with as long-term collaborators? And, that's changed a bit during the pandemic. We're a Black-led organization in Michigan, which is a swing state. So there are a lot of folks who care about the work that we're doing, during the even years. And there are a lot of folks who don't care about the work we're doing during odd years. And what that means for us, is that in 2020, we received a ton of money from folks who wanted to check off one of those two boxes, that, they wanted to either be in support of Black-led organizations, or they wanted to be in Michigan. And, for me, that meant having to create new strategies of how do you build deeply with folks and how do you build relationships with folks who are, transactional, to where you all have some sort of aligned shared interest. And how do you keep the folks who are transactional and want to be in Michigan for one time in 2020 after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor? How do you see them as Michigan and our work being a long-term investment, that's connected to their self-interest as well?
Thanks, Brandon. Yeah, that boom and bust cycle of sort of more electoral driven donation behavior is something that affects all community power giving building groups that we at Progressive Multiplier work with. And it's a big piece of why that being able to raise money from everyday folks is critical to breaking that boom and bust cycle for groups like Detroit Action. And I think, it's hard to raise that independent revenue because of some of these unintended consequences of donor centrism that we've created in donor culture. So I want to circle back to that later. Jennifer, anything you want to add in about Detroit Actions? Why people give, like your everyday donors?
Yeah, I definitely feel that there is an opportunity, like Brandon said, to share a vision and be a collaborator. But I also believe there's, in regards to the good or bad of validation, I believe in there's a self-interest, and affirming that self-interest when it's affirming equity and what does it mean to build an equitable world, is something that's not a bad thing. So I think when validation on values that are similar to ours and similar to leading the mission, is something that's super important to ground validation on and build on it.
Absolutely. Angie, where do you weigh in on this?
Yeah, so I think we're a little bit of a different situation in that the majority of our donors live in the U.S. and the majority of the communities that we're helping are not in the U.S. We have a U.S. Program arm, but it's very small and it's just started because of COVID. We sort of wanted to say, gosh, we probably need to help our neighbors at home too. But for the most part, we have the dynamic where we have the U.S. Donating to help other countries and the people who live there. So the first thing is, I think one of the reasons that people give to our organizations, and from an international relief perspective, if you add up I think this number is about right. If you add up all the charitable giving that happens in the U.S. every year, we're only 6% of it. So it is a very small group of donors that actually have an interest in international relief. So what I think about what their motivations are, do I think that there are the people that give an episodic emotional gift because they see something horrific that's happened? We've just spun up for the Ukraine emergency. Will we get donors starting in an hour that are donating because they're watching CNN and they're seeing how horrible it is, but they're not really taking the time to understand the issues that we're dealing with from a global crisis perspective and gender-based violence and gender inequality? We're a women's and girls organization, so we work through women and girls to fight poverty, et cetera. And so, yes, there are donors that I think are not as committed as other donors. So when we think about what motivates them or why they give, I think we have the full range. I think we have the people that are extremely educated about our issues or perhaps a particular issue. You could have somebody who wants to really be involved in the fight against child marriage. And you could have somebody else who really is focused on famine and the hunger crisis. So I think they're interest-based reasons. I think there are people that are emotional and might donate once and we may never see them again. As far as validating their giving behavior, I think our goal, because we only have 6% of all the charitable dollars that pass hands in this country, or we as a sector, not CARE, we as a sector only have 6%. And in there you have World Vision and Save the Children and Oxfam and lots of other big organizations. I think our goal is to raise awareness. I started at CARE 5 years ago. It's going to be 5 years in a month or two. And I couldn't believe as a 50-year-old how ignorant, and I actually think I'm a normally smart person. I couldn't believe how ignorant I was about international crisis. And so I think one of our goals as we try to validate the behavior of giving, no matter how they've decided to give, is to try to educate them, whether that's through an impact report, whether that's through just reaching out to them and trying to build a further relationship, et cetera. Now, I will tell you that COVID did change a lot for us because, first of all, we launched in the US for the first time in our 73-year history. But more importantly, COVID just exacerbated every issue in the developing world that we were working on. And in some cases, I think the estimate was that it pushed it back 20 years. And so I think that's changed how we look at things. I think that's changed how we have tried to educate the public differently. When we talk about how many people in the US are vaccinated, the people who aren't vaccinated, most of the time it's by choice. In the developing world, only 4% are vaccinated. And as a women and girls organization, the women are typically at the back of the line. So I think that's changed for us in how we try to talk about the people we help. And I would agree with Brandon on the one piece, which is part of our mission is to make sure that we're not just educating about the problem, we're educating about the solution. And we're providing, we can provide all the programs in the world, but the people that we are helping or that we're partnering with are the ones who actually create their own survival. And so we have to make sure that we always communicate that they're not victims. And in many cases, they're probably stronger than a lot of us. They're not victims, and we have to make sure we represent their agency that way. Sorry, that was a long answer.
It's quite all right. All good stuff. So I would love to see, based on our initial conversation here, Jean, do we have questions from our
Yeah, we do. And there's some pretty rich ones. So I think where we might want to start is with some of the language that you're using and the relationship between some of these words. So particularly the notion of validation. Can we actually define that a little bit from what does that mean practically? So why don't we start there? What do you mean by validation? What are examples of validation behavior, and how does it connect to the question of values, as Jennifer mentioned?
Anybody want to weigh in on that one?
I mean, I can start us off here. When I think about validation, I think about going back to the donor, and I sort of tie validation. So I might have a different answer here than everybody else, just FYI. I tie validation back to the concept, to the motivation, right? So if I know that someone has a particular interest or is donating to a specific emergency or something like that, the validation I want to give them is that their money is going to be used in the right way for the right group of people or for the right crisis, et cetera. So that's what I mean by validating their decision to be a donor with us, whether it's one time and we never see them again, or they're giving us something. Oh, somebody's car alarm just went off. That's funny. I was like, wait a minute, was that a buzzer that I gave the wrong answer?
Yeah, it's like, no, we're done with you. Jennifer, Brandon, what about validation at Detroit Action? How do you guys truly define validating a donor's act of giving to you?
Yeah, I definitely feel that, to Brandon's earlier point about solutions and identifying the donor approaches us maybe because they saw something in the news, or they know that something's happening in our community, or they heard a powerful story about what was happening in Detroit, and just validating taking action and taking the opportunity to take that action and affirming that action actually resulted in a solution. So I would say it's really leaning into how we resolved or need to continue to resolve a lot of the issues that are happening in our communities. And I think that is definitely a way to affirm and validate the donor, of just checking in about a lot of the big issues that we're facing about inequality in our country, and what does it mean to really lean in that way, as one of the missions that Detroit Action has.
Yeah, and I would just add, we primarily talk to progressive donors, in the work that we're doing, and that's where the self-interest, I think, aligns, is that we want to be able to have people who have, I'm a sort of traditionally trained organizer, and so when I, the phrase self-interest, comes from the Latin root of inter esse, which means self amongst others. And so when we think about self-interest is like, how do you see your interest amongst us, amongst community? And so like, when I think about it, it's like, if you care about housing justice, how do you see that interest amongst others, amongst other people who are doing it? So it isn't just a selfish act, it is a self-interest, it isn't a selfless act either. It's a act that includes others, and this idea of how do we build solidarity and how do we build trust together. So that's also why I think a lot about relationship, because I do see donations as a political action, and I do think that they are a political, it's an expression of political voice, but it also has to be rooted in some idea that like this work will help benefit the folks who are getting it.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can just follow up, Bethany, I think also what I'm hearing underneath these questions when we talk about values, is there a risk of inappropriate validation or a validating behavior that is actually contrary to our beliefs about how change happens? So I guess I'm inviting us to be explicit about that. Like, what would be an example of validation that is beyond the pale, right? Is actually colluding with ideas that are not in support of your long-term change strategies.
Got it.
Go ahead,
yeah, Brandon. I think the biggest one that I worry about is like, not treating our people, our members, our organization, our staff, myself and Jennifer as like active participants in the strategy and the decision making of a task. Is like, here is money to go run this thing. Here, it's a very transactional nature. Where it's not a thing that's been expressed by our membership, is not a thing that's interested by, that where me and Jennifer have a say in how it's, executed. It's, pay for play. Mm-hmm. And for us, what that ends up doing is reducing, Black and brown activists, the folks who are on the margins of society, to bodies and numbers, to just butts and seats. And, it strips their agency from being leaders. And so what we want, those are like and luckily, like the big names of foundations don't play like that. And, a lot of the intermediate size funders don't play like that. And they're interested in like building relationships. They're interested in building the capacity and the long-term ability for groups like ours to lead, to be central in the policy and the political space. But what we do see is that people who do play in the political space, the sort of super PAC election space, they are interested in, well, what we really need is you to knock these doors in a specific neighborhood for this specific candidate in order for them to win. Here's what we really like you to talk about. I know you all are a defund the police organization that cares about housing justice and that cares about immigration reform, but we really need you to just talk about quote unquote kitchen table issues for this specific candidate in order for them to win. And what that does is just treat our organization, treat our members, our volunteers who engage and volunteer because this their calling. It treats them as vendors.
Mm-hmm.
And one more question, Bethany, for this section, which is around corporate giving. And in your list of motivations, I think what people are calling out and upvoting here is that corporations may have a particular motivation around, image scrubbing. And I wonder how you all are navigating that.
I was actually going to tack on to what Brandon was saying, and then I can also address the corporate piece as well, because they a little bit go together. When I think of how do we make sure that we're not validating and creating a bad situation, I think that starts with whether you take the gift in the first place. So from my perspective, in my tenure at CARE so far, I know that we have turned down a $25 million gift because it was coming from a family that was perceived to be actually a part of the crisis that it was trying to be donated to. And that went against our ethical and moral approach. But it was tough because, at the very heart of it, we're humanitarians, right? So it's people first. And it's really hard when you're a humanitarian and you say, gosh, if I had that $25 million, how many people could I feed? but we decided not to take it because we felt that it was sending the wrong message, that you can buy a better, you can on one hand be causing a crisis in a political climate, and on the other hand say, but I'm donating to help the people. And we're just not willing to play near that line. So I think the first step is you can't take the gift. You got to be willing to turn the money away, turn that relationship away if it doesn't meet with your organization. And I would say this fully applies in the corporate world as well. We have a vetting process that we go through with all of our corporate opportunities. We don't just jump at every brand. That's always been that way at every organization I've worked with. I used to work at the American Cancer Society, and we had questions about, can you take money from a soft drink company that uses something in their product that's known to cause cancer? How can you do that and be the American Cancer Society? So I think there are a lot of things that you have to do, which starts with, you have to be willing to walk away if it's not the right match, whether it's a money match, a volunteering match, a branding opportunity match, or whatever it might be.
Thanks, Angie. Any other questions, Jean, or panel?
There are a couple more, but I think we can hold them and move to the next break. I'll keep my eye on them.
Sounds good. All right. Get into the good stuff. So, Brandon, as we discussed when we were preparing for today, the small dollar individual donors for Detroit Action just don't tend to be there. That's something that we see a lot of in city and state-based power building groups working with marginalized communities. And one of the things that fascinates me about that is that if you care about vulnerable communities, you should be a prospective donor for both CARE and Detroit Action. So I'd love for you to walk us through this graphic that you created about how you do your organizing work, and then talk about sort of where your different organizations sit and do this work, and how does that translate into the donors that we attract and how we reinforce that behavior with donor centrism. So if you could walk us through this graph, Brandon, that would be awesome.
Yeah, so so we are a just again, as for the context, so we're a grassroots member-led organization. Our work is about from the strategy space is to reshape and redefine the relationships, the power relationships in our community and in both our political and our policy space. And so when we think about our relationships from that lens, that also is the role of both the organizer who's carrying out policy and carrying out issue campaign fights, but also the executive director, me, who is in charge of organizing funders, stakeholders, as well as others in the community, for ultimately to carry out our mission and objective. The best way I like to describe and think about this spectrum is really like telling my story when I talk about like what got me into organizing. I in my first generation college student, I went to the University of Michigan. My parents, both working class folks. And when I got to U of M, though U of M is about 45 minutes away from Ann Arbor, it's also an entire world away from Ann Arbor, from Detroit. It's 45 minutes away from Detroit, in that, there are just so few Black and brown folks who are on campus, the amount of wealth that's on campus, and just the isolation that you feel being at a quote unquote prestigious university. And, I think what allowed me to be the person I am and be in this role I am is that, one, I, got involved in student activism and in my fraternity. And then towards the end of my college career, I got involved. I was, taking a class on community organizing, where we would go to Detroit and we would, do sort of service projects to help around leadership development. That happened concurrently with like two other super impactful things that put me here is that, one, I was, doing that and I was a volunteer for the Obama campaign in '08, knocking doors and making phone calls and really seeing like the power of working people jumping into, into a project, who had never been leaders in this world, taking up, gaining skills and becoming activists and getting their friends and neighbors involved. And then the third thing that sort of got me to this point that I'm at now is that, towards the end of my college career, I got arrested and I was in the Washtenaw County Jail. And I had a professor, that was a mentor. And once my legal situation got resolved, I went to him and, he, first he was like, what the hell are you doing? What's wrong? But then the second thing he talked to me about was like, what is it that you want to do? Like, what is your calling? Like, what are you, like, if you have these questions about opportunity and access and about power and about like, ultimately, like, what are the sort of conditions that make up our community? Like, what is it you want to do about it? And he talked to me about this sort of parable of the babies in the river, which is the thing I like to use when I talk to young organizers. So like, imagine, the parable just goes, it's like, imagine you're walking up to an idyllic river, you close your eyes, you're thinking about this picturesque village. And, it's green grass, ice-capped mountains, crystal clear blue river that's streaming through the middle of the village. And as you walk closer and closer to that river, you see a baby, and you don't just see not one baby, you see tons of them just floating through the river, streaming on by. And so when we think about like our approaches to that in society, so many of our approaches are usually like, let's just ask the baby to pull itself out of the river and send it on its way. Or maybe we pull the baby out, give it food and dry it off and then send them on its way. Or maybe we educate folks about why, babies in the river are bad. But community organizing is about like, how do you, asking why the heck the babies are in the river in the first place and holding accountable the people who are putting the babies in the river to begin with. And, our brand of organizing, is about how do we make sure that the families in the village, the babies themselves who've been pulled out of the river, and other folks are holding the person at the top of that mountain accountable for this and making sure that it never happens again. And I think when we think about the spectrum and we think about, how do we communicate that to both donors and to activists, it's about ensuring that they understand that our work is long-term. Like, we're not interested in just quick policy fixes that, put, numbers on the scoreboard or allow us to say that we were in the press. It's about like, how do we build power and how do we build agency for the long haul? So that way our people feel validated, so that our people feel validated. And so that way our, and so that way our communities actually can say they had a hand in change and that they have the skills to do so. And like, it's about engaging donors and funders and others who are interested in that long-term vision of power, like, at the root of our mission and our vision, and hopefully at the root and mission of their vision as well.
So, Brandon, you really, thank you for that. You really hit on that. One of the struggles of getting individual donors for the work that you do more towards the direct actions part of the spectrum is that it does require that deep understanding of, this is a long-term solution, this is a community-driven and implemented solution, even though both organizations are fighting that which harmfully affects vulnerable communities. Angie, when CARE doesn't work on the direct action spend end of the spectrum, but pretty much does direct service, you guys have a C4, you do advocacy, that is a very deep bench of offerings. But when we look at the way your small dollar donors come in, your individual donors, the asks do tend to be more around that left side direct service crisis kind of giving. You mentioned the Ukraine campaign that will be spinning up today. So like your current Facebook ad reads, the global hunger crisis is real and growing. Millions of women and children are on the brink of famine. With your gift, we can help families escape hunger, and your support saves lives. that makes money for you, and that brings in those donors, and that is a valid reason for giving that deserves, caring about women and children in famine deserves it. But it's an easier read than community-driven, a long-term entrenched policy and systemic change, even though at the end of the day, the net is making sure vulnerable communities have what they need and have their own agency. How have you guys landed at CARE on, given all of the work you do, where that fits?
Yeah, so we are one of those organizations that we work in a lot of different areas. And so so Facebook is one of those interesting places where you have such little real estate to get somebody's attention. And we use Facebook for acquisition. So if you were to look at our acquisition strategy in digital, compare it to our retention strategy in with our current donors, you would find a very different approach. So let me just go ahead and own up to that right there, which is when bringing in a new donor to CARE, like I said, I think I'm a pretty smart person, and I didn't realize how ignorant I was around international relief and global poverty and some of the gender-based crisis that we have going on when I joined 5 years ago. So that was me taking a job with an international relief organization. So imagine the person who's scrolling through Facebook and you've got them for like 10 seconds to get them to stop and look at your ad, right? So one of the things we have to do, because international relief is very complex, it's complicated, it's hard to explain every little thing that we try to do. So we know, for example, that the number one topic that people want to give to is around hunger. There might be wars and conflict and, hate to say it, gender-based violence issues and child marriage issues going around the world, which it's horrible and it's there. But the one thing that motivates people to give more than anything is when they think that there are large numbers of people going hungry. And it's a very serious situation. And so you'll see us in an acquisition effort try to bring somebody in across the front door, the threshold, right? Because there's so much more they need to understand, even about the famine and the hunger issue that's associated with poverty, or that other things that are happening, especially the gender imbalance issue where women are not allowed to do certain things, which could actually lift their family out of poverty and help with the hunger problem. But you can't do that on the first date. And so for us, we have to figure out what is the fastest way to educate somebody to get them to give us a chance to tell the rest of the story. And that's the complication with fundraising, right? It's if you're not a fundraiser, you can look at that and go, wow, why aren't they talking about X? Now, I will say from an advocacy perspective, and what we consider advocacy is we do have a C4, and their whole purpose is to work across both aisles in our government to deal with legislation, regulation, influencing opinion around how we fund international relief as an organization. That area is very much up and down when it comes to our political climate and what administration is seated at the time. But I will say that if I just go out with a general CARE ad and I put one up about feeding people versus funding the work to get our congressmen and women on board with a particular issue, hands down, they are always going to choose this, what I think you consider like a direct service area, which is they're always going to want to, and I think that goes way back to the initial conversation on motivation. I do believe that people want to feel like they're making a difference, even if they only have $5, or they want to feel like they're helping. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, again, you don't want to align yourself with a bad actor or somebody doing it for the real wrong reason. But I think in some cases, we do have to realize that, even if you go back to like the World War II generation, we like to talk about generational stuff in fundraising, right? The boomers are different than the Gen X, and the boomers are different than the World War II or the silent generation. The silent generation or the World War II generation, they used to basically, no matter what, and I think of my grandmother, who was born in like 1915, she, no matter how poor she was, she felt like it was her civic duty to give and help somebody else. It was just the way she lived her life. And I think that there are still people who feel that way, which is, I don't have a lot, but I want to still help. And then I think there are people who are looking for their name on a plaque or their name on a building. And sometimes that's okay, and sometimes that's not. But either way, whatever their reason for it is, I think if it's in alignment with the mission, it's in alignment with the mission. But that's sort of the answer on the Facebook situation. It's again, it's a complex issue, as I imagine Jennifer and Brandon deal with every single day, and trying to explain it that quick is hard.
Yeah, so Jennifer, if you want to weigh in here, I think how do you, given what we know, and why we wanted to have both organizations on the panel here, is that, there's a vulnerable community center to the work that you both do. Angie has the opportunity to lean into that more quickly understood piece to bring a donor in. The retention, totally different story. CARE does a phenomenal job around deep education issues. And that, I think, is part of changing donor culture. But Jennifer, what is the parity for an organization like Detroit Action? What is your thing that you can lean into to get somebody to know you quickly?
Yeah, for us is our member stories. We're a member-led organization. And at the end of the day, like, when facing crisis like the water infrastructure crisis in Detroit, and like facing other major climate crises that we're facing right now in the brink of a pandemic, like, we put frontline our member stories on how they're dealing with, evictions and insecure housing and so forth and so on, and connecting it to what the solution is, right? And connecting to what that action needs to be and why we need more support. And I think sometimes, like, I definitely hear folks, like, in regards to just like putting on a call to like support X legislation, but like, I also feel we have Detroit Action, for example, takes very seriously about changing the overall narrative, right? And like what it is to change a narrative about what are these social issues that are happening in our communities and what's causing these issues. And we do that by the power of story. And I think definitely that the power of story is always connected, helps to connect donors to like, what does it mean to like really lift up that voice and lift up that power, to then also have the same person that's being impacted be part of the solutions and offer a solution of what needs to happen. And I think when we frame it in that way, when it's not just I'm hungry, period, right? Like, it's also I'm hungry, and I'm hungry because there's a crisis happening and I lost my job and there was no support for that, right? I'm in the middle of a pandemic and I was laid off, and the support is this. And so I think when we really crystallize that and connect that to donors, it really allows them a moment to act. And, to Angie's earlier point about, the World War II generation, and just that connection of community is something that stories does allow, right? Like, at the end of the day, when someone shares their story, whether it's on our Facebook ads or, in other ways when we have events and members are sharing their stories of what they have gone through, it really allows the opportunity for that connection, right? And that connection to be like, how can I act in this moment? And if I'm able to act with a donation, with a donor allowance, it really provides a call to action that provides that community again. And I think there's a huge gap in that in our current community, right? And I really feel that the work of Detroit Action is about building those communities in Detroit and around Detroit to allow to make all levels and all tides to rise.
Thanks, Jennifer. That was amazing. Brandon, anything you want to weigh in here before we turn to questions?
Not necessarily. I think Jen hit on a lot of the pieces that I would hit up. I think the one thing I want to like add on is, our role, and I use this idea about relationships and like, and as like the central focal point of like how we do the work. And there's an understanding that, yeah, there are a lot of folks who aren't going to be in a relationship with us. They're actually like, here's a, you know, I would prefer to give my money in silent, or prefer to give my money, you know, in the dark, whatever. But it's our work to be able to get that dollar in there in the first place. And that's where like relationship comes from. That's where the work of like cultivating donors and having them see our analysis and doing the validation, you know, comes from in our mind. Is like, how do you get someone like, you know, a pop star gave us money during the pandemic. And so there was work that took place in order to get them there. And they may never give it to us again, but we got to continue to do the work and build the relationships, both with the people who got us there and with them and their folks, in order for them to see that this is the vehicle for them to exercise their political voice.
Great. Thank you, Brandon. Jean,
I was going to say, plus, Brandon, think about all that awareness you got if it was a really popular pop star.
That's true.
I think awareness like that is a good thing, as long as they're a good person.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a discussion going on and some upvoting going on about the challenge of trying to be an even more explicitly progressive organization when you know that your donor base is not particularly progressive or doesn't skew progressive, which probably would not be the case for Detroit Action. I'm not sure. As you said, Brandon, you're primarily orienting to progressive donors, but anything that anyone could say from their experience to that feeling of that gap between what the organization wants to be, is aspiring towards, and what donors are used to hearing or what their politic are.
Yeah. I would love to share a story from one of our other grantee partners, CASA in Action. During the pandemic, they got a lot of donors in who wanted to help immigrant families in the DC Metro, Pennsylvania, sort of Delmarva area. And when they went to tell that deeper story and validate the giving that was, you know, sort of inspired by the direct action of I want to feed somebody, to, okay, will you become a partner to help us change the system that is like, there is a reason that these immigrant families can't access food during this pandemic. The vitriolic, awful responses that I've never seen that kind of thing to retention pieces in my career, that there is just such a disconnect between the, you know, the we're doing this and we need to change the system. So Jennifer, I loved what you said about that it is, I'm hungry, this is why, this is the solution, and how do you put that all together? And I think that really is the nut to crack. So just as a perspective that we have certainly seen on that.
Yeah, I think I would lean in here. Like, I think for me, one of the biggest things is that it goes back to Brandon's earlier point about relationships, right? Relationships with the donor. So, you know, you have that one donation because of a news article, right? Something happened in the community like we've been talking about. And then, you know, but then that donor meets, you know, one of our members by name, right? And like sees the impact of what that has. I think there's been some questions about like, how do you create spaces for people? But then like also like build relationship about, you know, talking to that. I think it's a lot easier for a donor to say no to me than necessarily, you know, 20 Detroiters that are in a room about like, what does it mean to like give to Detroit Action, and to like foresee the change that they want to see in Detroit. And I think we need to establish more of that and I know, you know, the pandemic's not helping us to be in real physical spaces, but I do feel like it's more of like, how do we establish more relationships with the communities that we are in power with to change, directly with donors, right? And so like how does that look like as a way of like re-engaging that validation? That validation isn't just coming from Brandon and I, but it's also coming from the community that's directly impacted to see that change.
And that also means like making sure that our member leaders see themselves as stakeholders in this organization. So that's partly why we do stories and why we, when we can, we bring somebody with us to a funder briefing or something,
Yep.
because we want them to not just have them do the song and dance of this is why, I'm poor, or this is why we need money, but like, I am a leader and this is the place that I spend my time, and your investment helps develop more people like me and helps me continue to be invested in as a leader.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue to one of the most upvoted questions, which is around using stories in a way that preserves and promotes the agency of the person. And you just talked about actually collaborative fundraising, even not just communications, but fundraising. And any other ideas or what to stay away from in elevating individual stories?
I actually, there are a couple questions in the chat, and Bethany, I was messaging you sort of offline, which I would love it if we could wrap it into this conversation, because I think there are two folks that have said things like, how do you make sure that as you're telling a story, you're not being exploitative? And how do you make sure, that you're using words, if you've used the word vulnerable community, is that disempowering? So, or unempowering, whatever the right word would be there. I think I can tell you how CARE does it. And I think the international relief community has not been good at this. If you look back over the last 5-10 years of history of how perhaps the people we're trying to help have been represented. And there's a whole shift in the international relief community around this. I wouldn't say that it started with the social justice issues that occurred in the last 2 years, but that certainly amplified it. And I guess the way I would describe it is, if I pulled up, I didn't work at International Relief 10 years ago, so I'm sort of talking out of the air here. But if I pulled up an email 10 years ago to International Relief, it likely did have a little bit of victim painting in it, and a little bit of this is us, you're the donor, and we're trying to help them. And I think that tide has turned. And I think it's turned for a couple of reasons. So the first thing I would say is the way we stay away from being exploitative is that we hold ourselves to a very tight line of telling an authentic, accurate, whole story. So this gets at something that Brandon and Jennifer have both touched on, which is, yes, the need is there. If you leave the need out of the story, you're not telling an accurate story. There is famine, there is hunger, there is poverty in some of the countries that we work in. But if I only talk about that and I only show the impact of that, then I'm not telling the full story. I'm not telling the story about the mom and what she's doing to help feed her kids. And I'm not talking about what some of the programs are that we use to help educate a woman farmer so she can actually grow more crops and actually have extra money so she can send her daughter to school. Because typically the girls get to go to school second, the boys go first. And so I think part of it is making sure that you're telling the whole story and you never exaggerate. So that's one of the things we use. It's funny that whoever in the comment mentioned the comment about if you say vulnerable communities, we actually had a whole debate about this at CARE. And somebody said, if you're saying that somebody lives in a poor community, is poor the only thing that defines their community? And the answer is no. But you get in this real debate with people come up, and if you ask them, do you feel poor? They will tell you they feel poor, and they feel like they have less than what they want. And so it's finding the right balance to not paint people with a negative adjective, but also being able to tell the authentic story about what the situation is. If a mother is only able to eat every third day, that is an accurate portrayal of her relationship with food insecurity, but we just can't leave it there. We can't just stop the story there and say, please donate. We have to tell the full story and make sure, and obviously always make sure the person we're helping and the person we're talking about is aware and has consented to it. We're sort of shifting to first person storytelling. So since we're in the US and we have people that we help out of the country, we don't get the chance to actually walk somebody into a donor meeting. But we're moving to first-person storytelling because we think it's more powerful, and it actually provides the person we're helping with the ability to tell their success story in their voice, which I think is important.
Yeah, I would love to weigh in on this in regards to like the trauma, like that folks have talked about when sharing your story. And, you know, for me, like, I think it's so important that as we're talking about folks sharing their story, you know, when I got involved into organizing because I have a chronic medical condition, and I had a good job, quote unquote, good job. And this was before the Affordable Care Act. And my health insurance didn't cover my medical bills. And I was faced with thousands of dollars in medical debt and had to go into bankruptcy. And so my first campaign that I worked on was the Healthcare for America Now campaign, where I really was able to like put my story into action and to make difference. And I feel, you know, for me, like coming from that experience, it was very, yes, my chronic medical condition and reliving my hospitalization was very traumatic to talk about. But I have power in that, and I have agency in that on a solution to take my story to move that solution forward. And I think when we think about storytelling or sharing stories, it's really to change the narrative of what are the systems that are causing these situations and what needs to change in those systems. And so I feel like when it's tied to this is what happened, and it's also tied to the system change that needs to happen, it's really powerful. And it also invites the donor of not only providing monetary support, but could invite the donor of also providing support in other ways. And I think that could be really a unique opportunity for us to further think through as well.
And then the last thing I would just add to that is, like, you know, we think of, you know, first person stories as like the most critical because it allows people to tell the story of how they, not from the things that they just experienced, not from the things that happen in the world, but also like what are the solutions that they see as most important. You know, so they're offering the solutions, and then, you know, how they're able to express their call to become leaders in our movement. You know, when I think about, you know, stories, either my story or others, it's about like, how do we move away from the things that make us victims or have victimized us and allow us to be victors in this space. And so, you know, we do a lot really to give people the skills and tools to think about how they tell their story that's in a way that's connected, in a way that is respectful, in a way that is respectful of us and themselves, that we're not, you know, extracting. And really what that ends up also going back to is like, you know, we don't want this to be a one-off where you come and speak in front of a funder. We need you to tell your story, and then, you know, we're moving you out the door, you know, as we sign the check. Like, you are there, and this thing that you're in the room for is a part of something that you care about and that you have a say in, because you are a part of our organization. You're a stakeholder. And that's what I think about, like, when I think about stories and how do we make sure that we're doing them in a very respectful and not transactional manner, is that we're doing it in a way that really builds long-term power for the person. So if they leave the organization, they have the tool of being able to express themselves and be able to articulate their vision and being able to articulate, you know, again, how they became a leader in this space.
Thanks, Brendan. Jean, are there other questions in this thread that we want to dig into?
You know, I feel like a couple times people have been talking about the tendency toward white saviorhood of traditional fundraising. And I feel like you've all been addressing that in this really thoughtful discussion of storytelling and whose story is told and how are they supported to tell that story versus that story being extracted, where the hero, if you will, is the saver instead of the person who's identifying the problem and solution. So I feel like you've been addressing that, but if you want to speak to it any further, in terms of avoiding that, both in communications and storytelling, but I would imagine also again in that validation process of not validating that kind of thinking among donors.
Yeah, I would just make one quick comment, and Bethany said it early in the presentation. She made a comment. She goes, "The donor can't be the only hero." You know, if you looked up a fundraising book from maybe even 5 years ago, it would say things like, make sure the donor is the hero of the package, make sure the donor is the hero. And I think there is a formula for how you get somebody to give that's in the mass market arena, at least. And I do think they need to feel good. So you do have to address the element that they are helping. They are trying to do something, again, whether it's $5, $25, or $5,000 or whatever. So there's that piece, but they can't be the only hero, because again, the people have agency and they're responsible in some ways for the largest part of their survival, at least in our world that we're talking about. And we have to be especially careful, because if you look at care, you know, we're getting US donors, which are primarily white, if you look at our donor profile, and we're helping people that are primarily people of color. So we have to be extremely careful to make sure that we are not crossing that line. Again, we want the donor to feel good. We want to recognize that they're doing something that they didn't have to do. But at the same time, we have to tell the full story, which is the person, you know, in the village is doing 50 times as much to save their life than the person who's writing the check.
Yeah, I wonder, you know, I'm really curious as we think about like moving forward and what does it mean for validation of like, how do we think about that yes, you didn't have to give the check, and yes, you are still in the community, and like as being part of whether it's the global community or the community in this country, right? That we all have a responsibility of what does it mean to like change the systems that are creating these situations. So, you know, one of the things that Brandon and I are exploring is just like, what does it mean to have conversations with donors of just asking further than just the monetary support, and like if they are in relationships with folks, you know, especially if there's any corporate relationships that they may have that could influence some of the systems that need to be changed in Detroit and Michigan. We're always interested to like explore that, and that's something that we're relatively new at. But and to me takes away that white savior situation where like folks are feeling like the savior of the donor, but really allows for an opportunity of community building, and that as a community we have a responsibility for each other to create a more equitable community and live in that value. That's the value that you want to live in.
Yeah, and pushing it back on the donor as well to like, you know, what can you do to help build the conditions in our community to not only, you know, give the organizations like ours, of course, but also so that way we can actually have the policy and the sort of you know, community that we need to have those policies, those that our mission actually be fulfilled. You know, it's not enough if we got the Ford Foundation or whomever who has, you know, a really great program manager who cares about community, who cares about investing in leadership, who cares about the development, et cetera. And then every single foundation around them, you know, is terrible. So like, how are you as Ford Foundation you know, program officer, which our program officer for Ford is great, by the way. But you know, how are you building the relationships across the board and across you know, across the community to evangelize this message and to ensure that others are being organized in the same direction?
Yeah, and I would love to uplift one of our other grantee partners, Imagine Black. You wrote a great story about them many months ago, in that they, like many groups working in the racial justice space, got a lot of white donors during summer 2020. And I am so impressed by the way Brandon, I think you put it back on the donor, and they said, you gave to us, will you become an accomplice and join our accomplice program? And they hired their first white staff member, and that's been part of their project with us, is, you know, to lead what is this accomplice program, and how can people open doors influence policy, take everything that they can bring to bear, not just the checkbook. And they've actually put rigor around giving that path to those donors. And I think that's such a, they took a motivation that could have been a one and done crisis response, thing, and turned it, they actually, I think, did a phenomenal job of turning it, going from awareness and sort of news driven to using this platform to educate, build awareness, bring somebody deeper into the work, and actually changing donor culture, that it's not just about the check, it's bringing all of your power to the cause, which I thought was just a fantastic model. So excited to watch that one grow.
Well, it was so brilliant. And also what I loved about it from a sort of general leadership perspective is it didn't shy away from the tension, right? They weren't friends of, this is accomplice, this is what it means to be an accomplice. And you still have a chance to opt out, right? Because they still lost some folks, right? I mean, who were like, well, I'm not an accomplice, right? I just, I had that reaction, right? So what I love about it is it wasn't a colluding thing. It was just what you said, Brandon. It was saying, okay, yeah, we'll take these white donors if they're willing to understand more deeply what their motivations are and act in an accomplice way and choose from this call to action menu, right? And so it's a rigorous ask.
Absolutely. Jean, are there other questions?
No, I think we should move to your last section here, and then we might have time for a couple more.
Well, it's funny because we covered it in the organic questions, which I kind of love, because I think that means we're having the right conversation. But I think this, who is responsible for the storytelling, and being in that place of not traumatizing a person or a community, and how do we be good stewards of that, knowing that piece of the awareness is literally the linchpin in letting us set up the right kind of donor centrism. Anything else that anybody wanted to say here, or should we get back to the questions that he threw?
I think for like I think for the second part of this question, does this inhibit the ability of direct action groups to scale? I just really want to raise, it's that narrative building that I was talking about earlier is really about, this is like a long-term project, right? There's not going to be like one grand cycle, I wish, right? Or, one month that all the things happen magically, right? This is like long-term system change for Detroit Action. And with that means also long-term relationship with the donor, right? Whether it's directly with Brandon and I as co-executive directors, or directly with our members, right? And so I think definitely thinking more thoroughly of like, I'm really wrestling with like that validation, like how do we continue to build validation in a long-term cycle so that we can get to scale? It's something that we're really looking to build on at Detroit Action, so that we are able to like imagine a 10-year strategic plan on where we get the things that we want for our communities. And so I just really wanted to raise that in this moment and in this conversation about what does it look like to get to scale, and that's definitely like long-term commitment from our donors.
Yeah, I'm curious if we can, Bethany, I want to go back because we seem to have some folks, not surprisingly, who are trying to straddle an existing donor program with their aspirations for it, right? And when you go back to the kind of extreme example that you gave of one of your grantee partners around immigration reform, I kind of want to go back there for a second, knowing that it's extreme, but that we all probably experience some version of that, if not that extreme. And by that, I mean that there's a tendency or idea that we would message what we know they want to hear versus what it is that we need to say about the root causes and the kinds of reform or dismantling that need to happen to prevent this from happening again. And so if you can just go back to that story for a second, what's the outcome? I mean, with that vitriol that they received, I'm assuming they let go of a whole set of one-time transactional donors, right? But how do you resolve that in your program, right? Let's say somebody on this call is saying, well, I am going to take a chance. We're going to keep pushing, knowing that we're going to alienate some donors. Can you say a little bit about that process?
Yeah, and this is something that we've worked through with a lot of groups, because unfortunately because of donor centrism, the way we've built that validation culture, and not necessarily the best ways in all cases, that we do often fish for donors that aren't 100% aligned with what we actually do. And I think that we see groups changing that. But I always say to start with the data. Like, it is a very quantifiable thing to say, here's the donor pool we're putting at risk if we go a different way. So we see this a lot with groups that have traditionally leaned in more faith-based messaging, or, skirted that line if they had more of a faith-based driven, but they had nothing to do with, faith-based services and things like that. So it is a quantifiable issue. You are taking a risk, but you can measure it based on your donor profile. You can tell by who responds to what. Are they going to be okay with you pivoting? It's planning that pivot. And I think that the really important thing is that, you catch, what you bait for. And I think you have to be authentic in how you go out. So I had a client once where their entire fundraising program was built around, feed a hungry child. And that was less than 1% of the work they did, but it was what worked for donors. And it caused this huge rift between, here's the work we actually do, but here's what our donors think. And that alignment is so critical for thriving and growing forward and the long-term donor relationships, because if you don't tell that story in earnest, like, there's one thing to bring a donor in, as Angie said, like that Facebook ad, like that's what gets people in the door, but that's not what keeps them in the door. What keeps them in the door is the very different retention approach and bringing them in to a deeper understanding beyond their humanitarian kind of impulse. So I think that is, if you're going to make that switch, quantify it, plan it, and don't wait for what you don't want in the bucket.
And I would imagine focus on acquisition of the right kind of donors to backfill the loss that you're willing to take in that pivot, right? Yeah,
depending on how much you're going to lose, you have to invest, sort of counter invest in how much you need to bring in. So if you need to basically rebuild half your file, if you're going to make that leap, then that you have to make sure that your whether it's your board, your ED, whomever needs to get that is, you can make the ideological pivot, but there are real math and finance ramifications to it if you run a larger program, and you have to invest to counteract.
Let me pose this last question, which is both about, they're posing it as philanthropic, but I think it's actually relevant for major donors as well, who sometimes we try to shape, your money will buy X, right? If that kind of fundraising, if you give us $1,000, that's, one person going through a leadership development program, or, 1,000 people eating, or, that whole framework. We hear about trust-based philanthropy. Do you feel shifts as fundraisers yourselves, either in foundations and or in your approach to working with, say, high net worth folks or major donors, however you define them, in giving you more freedom and not having to make those kinds of line by line commitments in terms of expenditures?
I think so. I think we're starting to see more of that. I think people are doing more of the, we'll give you general operating support, as an opportunity to build trust. More of the sort of grant reports that aren't these big, heavy productions and are, phone calls as another opportunity to build support. Funders checking in and seeing, like, do you need anything? Can I connect you to someone? Those are really been good opportunities. And I think, like, the sort of like next frontier of like that sort of like trust in relationships is, there have been funders who've straight up asked us, like, well, what type of money do you need? Like, do you need C4 money? Do you need, C3 money? Can we get creative and do a ER grant over to you all? So that type of stuff, is real, really shows that people are interested in the mission and interested in, like, the development of the organization, instead of, checking a box.
Yeah, I would just add, as someone who started co-executives and like real in the day-to-day of fundraising in August in 2021, there's been some pivots that I've had to have with fundraisers, and like having those conversations and having the capacity and ability to like have that based on relationship, especially in the time of a pandemic, where like there's a lot of pivots that I can't control, right? And so I think it's been really, really, at least my experience coming into the sector in the hat that I'm wearing as a key fundraiser has been really helpful, and like it's been based on deep relationship, because the first phone call was not about how much money can you give me, right? The first phone call was about aligning on values and aligning on getting to know each other and getting to know and having a long-term relationship. So when a pivot came, it was based on the experience and the know-how that I have in the field of why that pivot needed to happen, and the trust that as an expert in the field that's what needed to happen.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Bethany, I'm going to hand it back to you to start to wrap us up with final words.
Yeah, I can't thank this panel enough for the amazing conversation today. This has been wonderful, and I think that it really it's gray. It's hard to define this cycle of what motivates somebody. How do we keep them validated and interested in a right and ethical way, and without causing unintended problems for other fundraisers and for the larger systemic issues that we face. So thank you to the panel for bringing your time and your brilliance and candor. I truly appreciate it, and would just love to, we have 3 minutes left, and I would love to give everybody like 30 seconds before we hand it over to Jean. And what's your best advice for building authentic alignment that isn't cringy donor centrism?
I would say build relationships on common self-interest for long-term commitment.
Love it.
I'm going to be a little bit more basic than that. And I'm going to say, hold yourself as a fundraiser accountable for not doing it. It has to start with us as fundraisers. I mean, we have to stop bad behaviors. And we have to correct those behaviors as we go to make sure that we're doing the right thing. But I also agree with what Jennifer said. She just said she said a really nice thing, really complex thing. I'm just saying, hey, guys, we're fundraisers. We got to fix this ourselves too.
Don't be cringy. Brandon?
And then I guess meeting in the middle of that is like, give and act in the movement and the mission of the organization. So how do you do things and how do you give that's rooted in the mission of the organization?
Give and act in the movement. I love that. I know Violetta's listening and has just grabbed all kinds of very tweetable, amazing advice. So again, thank you. And Jean, thank you for having the four of us to have this conversation.
I so appreciate you, Bethany, and all of you as panelists. It is a really complex topic, and I'm very empathetic to the people on the call who are trying to be change agents in their organization, both in their approach to fundraising and their messaging and their storytelling. And I'm thinking of something Angie said a little while ago very bluntly, which is you have to be able to walk away. And that means walk away from a method or a particular donor or a type of fundraising that's really not in sync with the values that you're aspiring. So I took a lot of inspiration from this panel. Thank you. I want to share that we have a great session in development for next month. It's called Reimagining Executive Transitions. We're going to be talking with folks who are going through the kinds of transitions that many of our organizations are now, trying to promote leadership within, BIPOC folks with direct lived experience, and how that is causing, or the tension that they're feeling with traditional search and transition practices. So it's going to be a very rich conversation. You're welcome to join us on March 24th from 2 to 3:30 for that. We look forward to seeing you then. And with that, again, thank you, Brandon, Jennifer, Angie, and Bethany for today's session. And here comes your evaluation. Thanks so much for being here.